My name is Kendall Barnes, and this is Creature Conflict, an audio podcast aimed to inform people about invasive species. In this episode, listen to my interview with John Odenkirk. So, you mentioned the largemouth bass. I know in other places where the Northern Snakehead has been introduced, it shares its main food sources with largemouth bass, but you said that hasn't affected the ones in Virginia.
Right. So just because you share a food resource with somebody else, that's called dietary overlap. That doesn't mean there's competition. Competition only comes into play if there's a limitation on the forage resource. And based on the fact that we're, a literal fish factory, the biomass of what pick your species is out just insane in the Potomac and even the Rappahannock. I mean, we live in a very productive, place in terms of our aquatic systems. And there's just, I would argue that there has been any competition because there's no limitation on the forage resource.
Have the northern snakeheads had any negative effects on human, or have they really just been like a good sport fish?
I mean, I have to be careful. I don't want to promote. I'm not in the business of promoting or rejecting. I'm just trying to tell everybody what's happened as best as I can. And what I do know is that snakeheads have created an unbelievable fishery. I have never seen so many people excited to go catch a fish and eat it. Although more people are releasing it now because they're becoming more fond of it, and they're worried that if they keep too many, then the population will decline. So we do creel surveys where we interview anglers and we say, what did you catch? Did you keep it? Did you release it? And we did find that right after the snakeheads were established, I think it was over 90% of anglers were keeping snakeheads. And the last time we did a creel survey was a few years ago, and I think almost 40% of anglers were voluntarily releasing snakeheads. So that's a huge jump. So it's almost like people have got that catch and release ethic like we have for bass now, where they don't want to hurt the fishery by harvesting a fish. Now, it's still, from a perspective of most fish, it's still a highly consumptive fishery. A lot of more fish than not are being kept, which is probably a good thing, because I mentioned exploitation is probably what helped suppress, the ultimate peak of those abundance curves. But there's no question that we've had DEQ check the fillets. The fillets are clean; they don't have PCBs or mercury in them, so it's good to eat. They are labeled as a commercial fish, which is rare for a freshwater fish. So in that, they're like blue catfish. They can be legally harvested and sold, and they're bringing. I mean, my mother-in-law bought a couple fillets at Wegmans a few weeks ago, and they're almost as expensive as snapper. I mean, it's a really good meat. Chefs love it. People love to catch them. We have a thing called R3, which is retention, reactivation, and recruitment, because Virginia, like most states, we're losing licensed anglers. And I mentioned earlier that we are a user fee agency. We don't get general revenue, but we exist on license sales. And if we have fewer people buying fishing licenses, then our income goes down. So we want people to fish. We want people to be happy fishing and catch fish and eat them. If that's within the management philosophy of whatever that species is. So we have not seen an excitement. I mean, people are going out and buying kayaks costing thousands of dollars because that's the best way to catch a snakehead, because you got to get back in that skinny water. And people are just really gung ho. I mean, they're buying these boats to go out at night fish with bow and arrow at night. I mean, we just seen all these things that we never expected to see with the creation of this fishery. So you'd have to say at this point, that for our perspective, it's been more good than bad.
This next question, it might seem a little silly. I wanted to ask you if you had ever heard of a snakehead attacking anybody. I heard about this. I don't know if you've seen it, the show River Monsters. They had a whole episode on snakeheads. And he said it, and I was like, I don't know about that one.
Yeah. I don't normally read blogs, but somebody forwarded me. They cut and pasted a section of a blog from Jeremy Wade or whatever his name was,
Yeah.
and it talked about him being a little scaredy cat of snakeheads, and told him that Odenkirk could teach him a thing or two, which I got a huge kick out of that. Funny story, back in the days when this thing blew up in our face, and we really didn't know, right? We had no idea in 2004 what was coming, other than the comic books, the late night TV skits, and the things that were driving the train at that point, which were obviously not overly scientific. But we were like, wow, we're in for some bad times here, apparently. And because of that, we was we survey typically every month from March through at least September. We're out in the water in at least four different creeks every one of those months. And usually, if people want to come out with us and we have room, we'll take them along. And especially in '04, '05, and '06, when the story was still really hot and fresh, there were typically a news crew would come out with us almost every time we were on the water, which is kind of cool for a while. HQ liked it because they were getting good agency exposure, flying the flag. And that got to be kind of a drain. You're always constantly having to answer the same questions for these reporters asking the same silly questions. And there was one, typically it was a reporter and a cameraman. Sometimes they'd actually have an audio person too. And this one woman asked me in the middle of this meet. At that point, we were tagging snakeheads because we were trying to get some information about migration and growth. She says, "Well, how many times have you been attacked?" And I looked at her and I kind of laughed. I said, "Never." And she goes, and you could tell she was very shocked and almost sad. And then she said, "Well, how many times have you been bitten?" I said, "Never." And again, the same look. And it was almost disbelief. "Are you sure?" She said. And I said, "Yeah, I'm pretty sure." And that was just, but that was what she expected to hear. Yes. But honestly, to me, I fished my whole life, especially saltwater, and bluefish are much more I would just call them vindictive. I mean, a bluefish, when you're trying to unhook a bluefish, you can see its eye tracking your finger and it will lunge for your finger. And I've been bitten by bluefish more times than I can count. I've never had a snakehead bite me, and I've handled thousands of snakeheads. So take that for what it's worth.
I knew it was a little silly, but I saw it and I was like, I have to I have
Of
to
course
know.
you do. And they do have teeth, and they have teeth like bowfin. I mean, unless you pry back the lips, you can't really see the teeth. And to be honest, I don't know why they have them. Because as I mentioned, we've handled thousands, and we've pulled food contents out of most of those thousands. And I have yet to see a single food item that has perforations in it. Typically, if again, bluefish is an example. Even largemouth. I mean, largemouth pretty much inhale their food too. But a fish like a bluefish, you're going to find pieces in a bluefish. I mean, it's like a cutting machine. And we had snakeheads in our office for a long time as educational. People would come in the office like, "Oh, yeah, I've heard about that, but I've never seen one." Because a lot of times people, especially early on, were turning in bowfin or eels or take your fish as the snakehead when they weren't. So they were needlessly killing these fish thinking they were snakeheads. So we're trying to educate people what they really look like. And so we would feed that fish live minnows, fathead minnows, on a weekly basis. And we could watch them feed, and they create this vortex and they just inhale their food like a largemouth bass. And so because of that, they don't use their teeth. I've never seen a half of a fish in a snakehead stomach. So anyway, enough about the teeth, but I guess they're just there for show, maybe to attract the ladies or something. I don't know.
Okay. So I know we've talked mostly about the snakehead, but I also, while I was researching you for this interview, I also found that you discovered and eradicated the first population of T. dyspinosa in the U.S. Do you want to tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So water chestnut. It's not the chestnuts that you get in your Chinese or Asian food. It's different kind of water chestnuts, and somewhat more problematic. And there's a the original water chestnut was Trappa as the genus, just like Lepomis was the genus of the sunfish. Trappa was the genus of this aquatic plant, and then natans, Natans, natans was the genus of the true water chestnut. What was that had was in the Potomac River back in the 50s and had to be eradicated by the Corps of Engineers at a cost of millions of dollars, even back in the 50s. And a plant that truly does seem to have real ecological downside, in my opinion, more than, say, hydrilla does. Um, and so this was a plant that we didn't want and don't want. And on one of our snakehead trips out of Gunston Bay, Gunston Cove, Pohick Bay, we were coming back into the boat ramp at Pohick, and we were motoring along, idling slowly along the shoreline. And we looked over and we saw a plant in the water. It looked sort of like a small lily pad with deeply cleft leaves. And we said, "Wow, that's a weird looking plant. Nobody on the boat had ever seen it. Let's pull a sample up and take it back." We have some keys, some diagnostic keys back in the office, and see if we can key this thing out and figure out what it is. Well, we keyed it out to be Trypanatans, water chestnut. And then I called Nancy Rubicki, who was the USGS botanist who had done a lot of work with hydrilla on the tidal Potomac. And I sent her a picture of it and showed it to her. And I said, "Hey, I think we found this in the tidal Potomac. It doesn't seem like it should be there, should it?" And then she's like, she really sounded the alarm. She's like, "Oh my God, no, that's water chestnut. That was eradicated half century ago. That should not be there." And so we organized a volunteer group to hand pull it. The best, especially, was it was a small isolated patch, and it was determined rather than putting chemicals, especially in tide water that's kind of moving, with flow. At low tide, it's really easy to get in there and just rip it out by the roots. And so we recruited, I don't know, we had 50 or 60 volunteers come out there, a summer day, low tide, just get muddy, get wet, and have fun, and just pull up a bunch of these plants. And it took a couple of years because the seed pods remained viable. So it was a little battle of attrition. The first year we took out, I can't remember, a few tons of plants. The next year was a few tons of plants. And the next year was like 2 5-gallon buckets worth, and then it was gone. And during this whole process, though, Nancy Rubicki figured out that it wasn't natans. It was actually a new species that had never been identified in the United States before, called bispinosa, because it only had 2 horns. That's the bi, rather than natans, which had, I think, 3 or 4 horns. So this was a different, closely related species, but a different species that had never been documented in the U.S. before, which we eradicated it. I think it's the only known eradication of water chestnut, especially in a tidal, an open system. Because typically the book is, if something gets out in an open system, it's over. It's you're not going to get rid of it. So I think we're really lucky that we caught that small isolated patch early and got rid of it. Now we did find it since then in a bunch of little ponds, which is probably how it got there. It's in stormwater ponds all over Northern Virginia. And since then, it's been added to the Virginia Noxious Weed List at VDAX. We've got some other agencies involved with it. We got Fairfax County, actually got their own guy working on it through their stormwater fund, because most of the occurrences of this water chestnut are in stormwater detention ponds. So, I think what happens is the Canada geese are moving these seed pods around. The 2 horns on this thing are kind of like Velcro. And so when the Canada geese come in and start swimming around and preening themselves, they get up against these little things and they attach, and then they go to a different pond, and then they come off. And it seems like that's how, because I don't think we have people wanting to move water chestnut like snakeheads because they want a population. I think it's incidental. The geese really don't know what they're doing.
Right. Okay. Very cool. Um, how can people prevent the introduction of new invasive or non-native species?
From anybody that wants to try to help in this, and we do ask for people's help because it's hard to keep all this out. And there's some basic rules, stop aquatic hitchhikers. So when you leave one body of water to another, whether you have a kayak or a canoe or a boat trailer, you want to look at your trailer, look at your gear, look at your stuff. And you don't want to be dragging things around. Like, you don't want to have water in your live well, and release that in a new lake versus where you were before, or a new river. You don't want to have stuff hanging off your trailer, vegetation and things like that. Most of it's common sense. But if you think about it, a lot of times people don't think about it, but you just try to break that chain of a movement of one thing. And of course, don't dump your fish bowl out into the nearest waterway, because you don't want to kill your fish. It's you're just going to have to deal with that some other way, but you don't it's illegal to stock any fish in any public water, which is basically any water except for a private pond in the state, without a permit. So, yeah, we obviously, hopefully people aren't going to do that.
You'd be surprised.
Yeah, right. No, I know. I wouldn't be surprised, really.
Don't be surprised. Um, well, that's about all my questions. Is there anything you want to ask me, or anything you want anybody listening to this podcast to know?
Uh, I think we probably covered everything that is germane to this typical snakehead questions we're going to get.
I mean, it doesn't even have to be about snakeheads. It can be about
Right.
fish,
Right.
encouraging
Yeah.
people to get licensed, honestly. I mean, Virginia Beach, lots of people fish.
Yeah, well, that's the great thing about fishing. You don't need a license till you get to 16. So, try to get kids out there, get them excited about fishing. I mean, it's a great activity. I've done it my whole life. I grew up fishing. As you could probably tell, I like saltwater fishing, just probably more than freshwater fishing, but it's all good. I've got my own pond now, so I fish out there. I just fish, be outside and fish. Just love it.
Yeah. That concludes the second half of my interview with John Odenkirk. Thank you for listening, and please tune into my other episodes.